Surgeons of Reddit, what has been your biggest OS moment? I doubt you'll get too many real stories. Mine is extremely rare, as I was the patient, but awake for the surgery. I was supposed to have a bump on my back removed. Nothing huge, just a lump of some kind. For insurance reasons they did it as an ambulatory in the or hospital instead of the surgeon's actual office. So, I'm wide awake, face down in the OR. I had picked him as my surgeon, because his main practice was plastic surgery. At the time I lifted weights a lot, and spent a lot of time working my back. I wanted as small a scar as possible. I was vain. He begins with the first incision, then goes for a second, larger, then goes deeper, I guess, and realizes the bump is just the extruding tip of a cyst that cut through my back to the back of my lungs. He wasn't used to operating on alert patients. As soon as he realizes, he just says, "Oh fuck." That was the beginning of a 4-hour surgery for which I was awake. What they cut out of me was the size of an adult fist. Enclosing the wound they drew in so much flesh, for lack of a better word, because of my lack of medical understanding, that my right arm became essentially inflexible. I couldn't lift weights for years. All that precious work shot down the drain. What an asshole I was. Veterinarian here. This happened in my 4th year of vet school. I watched a bull stomp his own intestines. A very valuable bull had an obstruction in his intestines that needed to be removed. People will only put the amount of money a food animal is worth into surgery to fix it, so we had to do this on the cheap. Full anesthesia on an animal that big is crazy expensive, so we did a standing surgery. What that means is the bull is put in a chute, numbed up really well, and other than light sedation they are totally awake and standing for surgery. So the surgeons make a 2 to 3 foot vertical incision in his right flank and start pulling out armfuls of intestines and handing them to me and the other vet student assistants. There's a sterile drape on the bull and we're all in full sterile gowns. The obstruction was pretty bad, so they had to remove a couple feet of damaged intestines and then sew the ends back together. There is a lot of blood. A lot. The bull is starting to get stressed, impatient, and weak from blood loss. It starts kicking at the chute and trying to move. It gets more sedatives and the surgeons try to sew faster. Everyone is sweating, and there's a lot of swearing going on. The puddle of blood at our feet is getting bigger. The bull does a side shuffle and the intestines being held by another student are trapped between the bull's ribs and the metal bars of the chute. This is bad. Even a few seconds of this can do permanent damage. The bull is too heavy to just shove over, so they remove one of the side rails of the chute to free the intestines. The bull is getting really pissed off and now is trying to lunge from side to side, and we are ordered to let go of the intestines we are holding to keep the bull from breaking our arms against the rails of the chute. The bull is really freaking out and manages to get partially and then completely out of the chute and starts running around the room mooing and stomping and ripping huge chunks of intestines out of itself. Blood and guts are everywhere. Gallons of blood. Keep in mind this room is in a barn, and while the area around the chute was clean, the rest of the room is covered in hay and dirt. Some huge guys manage to subdue the bull and wrestle it to the ground and they give it more sedatives and pain meds. My job was to sit on his shoulder. Another bigger student is sitting on his head. Everything is a complete fucking fiasco at this point and I just felt so terrible for the poor bull who was bellowing non-stop. They wash off his mangled intestines as best as they can, stitch the ends together, dump a shit ton of penicillin in his abdomen and close him up. The bull survived surgery and then was hospitalized and got tons of IV antibiotics and fluids and care. Every day his temperature got higher until he finally died a week later from a massive infection in his abdomen. So that was awful. I have absolutely no idea what they told the owner. As far as I know, no one got sued. I woke up during the last part of my gallbladder removal. I felt this pressure as my surgeon had him for a prior operation. Funny guy was trying to close one of the wounds. I lifted my head, we locked eyes, and he had this startled "oh fuck" look. Then he snapped back to normal, said patience up, and the anesthetist was on that shit. Woke up an hour later in recovery. This one's from my dad. We were putting up a central line for a drip with an 18G needle, 2mm relatively big compared to most needles, in the patient's external jugular, and all of a sudden the needle went right into the jugular. We all started panicking, because usually with a drip the needle is meant to come out and only the plastic remains. But now we had lost the needle inside this guy's jugular. Before we could even fish it out, it was gone. I looked at the fellow surgeons and nurses, and before we could do anything we rushed him right into theater. After a few minutes we fished the needle out near his subclavian vein closer towards the shoulder, and we breathed a sigh of relief. Craziest, probably a medical student passing out face first into the wound, then falling backwards and cracking his skull on the floor. He starts bleeding from the head and isn't moving. Just total silence for a few seconds. We didn't know whether to laugh or yell at him or what. Heh. Luckily I didn't have to have that talk with the family. Favorite, when I was a student my chief resident was sleeping with one of my friends who was also a student. We were both operating with the chief of surgery when someone pages the chief during surgery. The nurse looked at it and said it wasn't important. Chief gets annoyed and asks her I just call it back. She replies it was a text page. Would he like her to read it? He says yes. It was my friend telling him she wanted to meet him in a call room after he was done. Paraphrasing here. Another awkward silence. Residents sleeping with students is a no-no, and having them page you in surgery is one too. But the chief of surgery was having an affair with the nurse. We all knew it, so after a rapid-fire exchange of significant glances around the table, we all shut the hell up and finished the case and never spoke of it again. Way back in the day, pre-op was done with alcohol-based cleaners. Naked, sedated guy with a light sheen of cleaning fluid on him plus static electric spark equals fully engulfed in flames. Everyone just stood there for a second till someone grabbed a sheet and put out the flames. Surgery went well, no complications, slight suntan. Balboa Navy Medical Center, San Diego, old surgeon. My first C-section was quite the shocker, but after that not a lot faced me anymore. This event occurred during one of my internships as a high schooler to see if medicine would be my field. Why, I'm not sure, but they let me attend a C-section. They placed me at the feet of the woman that was numb chest down. I give her a little nod and the operation starts. Well, no one had thought to tell me that once the belly is cut, the liquids go out too. This is a logical thing, but I was seated at least 3 meters from the feet of said woman and the fluids gushing from her abdomen came all the way to my feet. Here is me, standing in a woman's pregnancy fluids. Oh. Fuck. I must have looked very shocked, because the other surgeons had a laugh about my reaction. Ever since, I've not been shocked once. From /u/I'm Ked nurse. I was in charge in the unit the other day, and this happened. We had a patient in the ICU who had some big abdomen trauma. He had gone to the OR and was too sick to be able to close his abdomen, so we left it open. We had a piece of plastic covering, like a bag, covering his intestines, and then we placed a vacuumed sponge dressing on top of that, called a wound vac. The patient's nurse called me into the room to look at the abdomen, because she thought she saw pieces of the bowel seeping out of the bag and getting sucked against the wound vac. I agreed and thought the bowel looked pretty dusky as well, so we called the doc to come and look at it. The resident agreed and talked to his attending who told him to take the wound vac off, tuck the bowel back into the bag it had escaped from, and put a new wound vac on. It all just sounded like it was going to be a disaster, but whatever. So, resident comes in, takes off the wound vac and the bowels had become very swollen from the fluids, trauma, etc. So when he took the wound vac off, they all slipped out of the patient. The bag had dislodged significantly. We would tuck the bowels in one side, they'd spill out the other. Here we had this guy in his bed, disemboweling, and we simply could not get everything back in him, in the bag, or anything. Luckily, the drugs we had the patient on kept him very nicely sedated, and we had other drugs to control any problems with his blood pressure, and the guy wasn't overtly bleeding. It was messy. We really just had to step back and say, well, shit, how do we get this guy's guts back inside him? Ended up having to call in 6 other people to help tuck things here and there until he could get back to or for them to get everything back into its proper place. Had a friend with a swollen area on his lower back where it got to the point where he could barely sit. So he goes to his family doctor. The doc says, yeah, that's a pilonidal cyst. We should probably go ahead and take care of that. He told my friend to take off his shirt and lay flat on his stomach. So he's laying there and waiting, and the doctor says you're going to feel a poke, and is at this point expecting a local. Well, first it turns out the poke was actually a scalpel, not a local. He said it basically felt like someone took a fire hot poker and drove it into his back. He then hears the doctor exclaim, "Oh boy, we have a pumper," just as he feels warm blood and pus now pouring all over his back. The nurse's face, which was the only thing he could see, went from a warm smile to what he termed as pure and unadulterated fear as the doctor is screaming for her to get gauze and towels. The doctor climbed up and laid on his back to apply pressure for about 10 minutes until the bleeding stopped. So yay, I'm hoping I never get one of those. When I was in residency, my first solo procedure was a spinal surgery on a 16-year-old kid, a girl. And at the end, after 13 hours, I was closing her up and I accidentally ripped her dural sac, shredded the base of the spine where all the nerves come together, membrane as thin as tissue. And so it ripped open and the nerves just spilled out of her like angel hair pasta, spinal fluid flowing out of her and the terror was just so crazy, so real. And I knew I had to deal with it. So I just made a choice. I'd let the fear in, let it take over, let it do its thing, but only for 5 seconds. That's all I was going to give it. So I started to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it was gone. I went back to work, sewed her up, and she was fine. Worked in or for a couple years as a biomedical engineer. Sprinted to the room when equipment wasn't working, right, or, more often, the surgeon or anesthesiologist didn't know how to use the equipment. This happened so much. With about 70 Ors, this was a fun day. 1. A surgical table was malfunctioning going into full Trendelberg, table tilts to a serious angle. Was tilting on its own and patient was sliding off the table. The whole surgical team was holding on to the patient as I run in. The fix was I slammed the controller against the floor a few times. Patient was okay, but blood everywhere. 2. A resident was putting in a trocher and misplaced it, sliced open the aorta. 12 hours of surgery to repair. She was going in for a simple procedure. 3. Surgical robot froze in a case, had to reboot, but the arm was grasping a main blood vessel. So we didn't want to reboot for fear the arms would rehome and let go of the vessel. Also, we lost video when it froze, so we couldn't just retract the instruments. Lots of people saying oh shit. I'm the one pushing the power switch, so if it tears out someone's organs they all look at me. 4. Brain surgery. Microscope video feed crashed. I was trying different video connections to get the overhead monitors back up, but every time I accidentally hit the scope with my hand, causing vibrations that were pretty magnified while working in the brain. He told me to never mind and to get the fuck out. This was my first day, so it's okay. Many more. Ors are a scary place, but fun and exciting job for sure. Rewarding to save the day, while a team of surgeons / nurses / pars all thanking you profusely. The medical stuff really becomes a blur. Complications, bad outcomes, crazy patients. I dunno, but after a few years even the bad stuff just becomes part of the routine. But there was one moment that still sticks with me from training. I was called into a meeting with the program director, which is never a good thing, and I wasn't entirely sure why. He makes some small talk, then start asking about one of the junior residents who had been on my service. Definitely one of the weaker residents, but hardworking and likable. I start talking about her performance and her relationship with the other residents, her strengths and weaknesses, etc. After a minute I came to the horrible realization he wasn't just asking about her, he was gathering ammunition to fire her, and I was part of the firing squad. I jammed on the brakes and tried to talk her up, talking about her work ethic and how well she got along with the nurses and the team. But we both knew it was a done deal before I sat down. I don't know why it bothered me so much, compared to kids who burned to death and the like. But that sudden realization, while I was sitting there, that someone I kinda liked personally, who had spent most of their adult life struggling in undergrad, medical school, and the lab, who had what I suspect was 6-figure debt, was about to get their career destroyed, just stunned me. I don't know if she was going to be an unsafe doctor. I think the fact we liked her allowed her to slide further than she should have, in retrospect. But of all the terrible things that happened in residency, that's the one I think about most often. I was a junior doctor working in neurosurgery back in 2008 when one of the senior registrars, I suppose the equivalent is chief resident in the USA, told me his most unfortunate moment. In order to have a patient's head stabilized for surgery, he was using a frame that had a set of 3 spikes that held the head in place. Due to the angle he needed to approach from, this required the patient to be face down. As he was placing the head of the anesthetized patient onto the frame, the head slipped, and his eye landed onto the spike, perforating the eyeball. Panicking and thinking that his career was now over, he then, rather busily, started poking at the eyeball trying to work out what was what until the anesthetist told him to stop. They then called the ophthalmologist who came to tidy up what was now a completely ruined eye. After the surgery, terrified, he went to explain to the patient what had happened. Understandably fearing the worst, anger, distress, and tears, received the response of "That's okay, I was blind in that eye anyway. Luckiest bastard ever." Yeah, this really happened to me when I was in training to be a cardiologist. I was in my 2nd or 3rd heart procedure / catheterization when my senior doctor got sick, ripped of his surgical gown, and ran out of the room. The doctor had just yelled "Oh, no," and left. I had just positioned these catheters with wires into the sleeping patient's heart. They were just hanging out there pulsating to his heartbeat. Apparently, the doctor had gotten food poisoning and made a run for the bathroom, never to return. So I've never made it to this point in the procedure before, and I'm just wondering where to take it from here. I haven't even been taught how to take them out safely. I'm looking at the vitals and monitors like F at percent. What do I do now? Of course they page my senior cardiology fellow in training who is taking a nap and not returning any pages or calls. No other doctors around. Finally, thank God, my tech/assistant who has done these procedures since before I was born gives me a nudge to flush the catheters, which I do, to prevent blood clots and death essentially, and after a few minutes properly removes the catheters and wires. They get treated like shit, but I've saved all of the fellows in training and senior doctors many times in complicated situations with their knowledge.